Are we living in the last days? Scriptures allude to that. Jesus Christ said that that time would come. A lot of people don't realize even that Jesus Christ existed anymore, nor the things that he said. But he did give a warning to those that would take heed. And one of those warnings is found back in Luke 21, verse 36. We've referred to this scripture many, many times. And it says, "Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." So there's a couple of things in here that he tells us to do. One is to watch. The second is to pray. Well, what are we to watch for? The Bible is literally filled with warnings leading up to Christ's return. These warnings will be evident to those who know what to look for. I look around me every day and I see scriptures from the Bible that seem to be coming alive on my TV screen. It's almost like the Bible is being fulfilled right there before your very eyes. And we in the Church of God, the ministry, try to explain many of these warnings in our sermons, in our articles, and our sermonettes. We want the people to be prepared, and that's one of our jobs and responsibilities, is to warn the people, to teach the people, instruct the people, and to keep the people motivated and inspired. So I can't go through all the warnings. There are many, many warnings, but I want to go through one today. One that is, it may be so subtle that we may not even be able to recognize it. But we're going to recognize it today. If you turn back to 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, and the Apostle Paul was writing to this young evangelist, and he has to instruct him, he has to motivate him, and sometimes he has to tell him to stir up the gift that's in him. As any of us, sometimes we have peaks and valleys in God's church. Sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down. So he's going to explain to him this. And you begin reading in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1. I'm going to read 5 verses here. This know also. He must have told him something prior to that, but he said, "This, I want you to know this also, Timothy." And you can read before that to find out what he told him. "But in the last days, perilous times shall come." Perilous times shall come in the last days. Now, from their time to our time, it's been a couple thousand years passed. And we even had them allude to in Acts 2nd chapter that they were living in the last days then. So beginning during that period of time, a lot of events are going to take place. And as we get closer to Christ's return, they're going to escalate and get even more inevitable and more visible to us. But he says, here's some of the conditions that will be extant. "Men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers." In other words, not have any respect for God or His Word. Disobedient to parents. Any more children seem to be ruling the families rather than the parents. They're unthankful. And I think we in this country are unthankful because we don't seem to be very appreciative of the blessings God has poured out upon us. We don't seem to like it here. People are always criticizing it. They don't take into consideration what we have in this country. Maybe they ought to go to another country and live sometime and see. It says they're going to be unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers. In other words, they give the word and then they break it. Maybe that's one of the reasons we're having so many marriages that are failing today. False accusers. I can't read that passage in here and think about fake news and what's going on in the news today. And it may not be a lie, but they twist the truth, which is a lie. False accusers are incontinent. In other words, people are very fierce and they're unable to placate. You can't compromise with them. Fierce, despisers of those that are good. You know, I was listening to some of the people from Hollywood that called themselves conservatives, and many times they're afraid to stand up and say what they believe because they're afraid of the repercussions, because they are hated out there. The conservative people are hated. And don't mention the name of God, whatever you do. There will be traitors. What do you think's happening here with all these leaks from the White House? That's nothing more than treason when you're giving up national secrets to the public or to the enemies. heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness and denying the power thereof. In other words, they attend their church services, but they aren't getting anything out of it. They aren't doing anything with it. Now, that's a synopsis of many, many events that are taking place. And if you're looking at world events today, you're able to see many of these come alive. But I want to focus in on one of them that's taking place now in these last days. And the first part is, whereas men shall be lovers of their own selves. I was walking through a store recently, and I saw this sales table, and it had all these items on it, and they were these long sticks that were sticking up. And I said, what in the world is that? Well, I went over and checked, and you know what it was? It was a selfie stick. You can buy a stick, and I guess you put your camera out there, and you take pictures of yourself. You know, some people have actually lost their lives by sitting on the side of a bridge or on the side of a cliff and falling off trying to take a picture of themselves. And I saw something on Fox News the other day, and it says there was a series of pictures that were taken right before something cataclysmic happened. This one guy was sitting on the side of a cliff and reaching out trying to picture himself, and next thing you knew, he was gone. So people love themselves. They love themselves by going on to YouTube and posting pictures of themselves. Actually, people have committed crimes, and they have to post it so everybody can see what's going on. In fact, the police have sometimes captured some of the criminals because they confessed right there on the screen. I don't know, do they not know people looking at that? I begin to wonder if I was ever going to commit a serious crime of any kind, I certainly wouldn't want the public to know it. I wouldn't want anybody to know it. Because anytime more than one person knows something about it, it's susceptible to getting out. I believe one of the Proverbs says, you better be careful what you do because even a little birdie might hear it. Well, there's a lot of little birdies around with big ears anymore. So people are focused on themselves. Now, one of the primary issues today that focuses in on this principle of people loving themselves is a term that I never heard of when I was a child. It's called political correctness. People want to be politically correct. Now, so what in the world is political correctness? So I looked it up on the internet. I asked for a definition of it, and political correctness is being afraid that what you say or do may offend another group or persons, particularly of a lower mentality or a lower group. So we are constantly being offended in this world today. There's somebody that gets offended over virtually everything. Now, Isaiah said something about that in Isaiah 29. Go back to Isaiah 29. Now let's notice what Isaiah was inspired to write many, many centuries ago. Isaiah 29 and verse 20. It says, for the terrible one is brought to naught, and the scorner is consumed, and all that watch for iniquity are cut off, that make a man an offender for a word, and lay a snare for him that reproves in the gate, and turn aside the just for a thing of naught. Now, lay a snare means false testimony. We see that all the time. People lie all the time. I wonder how many of those politicians have committed perjury. All those people in those various investigations, they're brought in before the special prosecutors and Senate intelligence committees. I wonder how many of them told the truth. One day one will tell you this, the next day somebody will tell you that. Nothing ever seems to happen to them. But it says people will be offended for a word. Was it Paula Dean that said something that she had said she used the N-word back 30-some years ago? And she like to lost all of her businesses. People were certainly offended for that. Well, just notice some of the things that's happening. And I can't by no means go into all of them. But I noticed the other day, down in Louisiana, the people in all their wisdom is beginning to do away with all the Confederate statues and the monuments of the Civil War because somebody's offended. Because during the Civil War, it was a war that involved slavery. And so people allude to the fact that it's alluding to slavery. All the statues of Robert E. Lee and the famous generals. Forget the fact that it's history. You know, the children of Israel could be complaining today about being in Egypt for all those years in captivity, but I don't hear anything about that. It goes on and on. Now, I understand that Now they're upset and they're trying to remove the Confederate flag because it, likewise, is a symbol of slavery. What gets the cake is there was this Confederate museum. I forget which state it's in. And so the mayor or some of the politicians said that he asked the people to remove the Confederate flag from the museum, from the Confederacy. Well, they end up having to close down the museum. How do you have a museum without a Confederate flag? So they're closing down the whole museum. And they're taking all these artifacts and they're putting them, storing them in one of these buildings somewhere. You notice how they're removing prayer from public places, such as school, town hall meetings, and so forth. I read recently where this young man who was a salutatorian, he'd worked through his high school years and he was going to give the salutatorian address. And of course, I guess anymore, the principals always have to check it out, read it beforehand. So they checked it out and this kid made a mistake. He mentioned God in it. He wanted to thank God for his high school education and so forth. They wouldn't let him read it. They took it out. So what happened was some person across the street had a large lot, and so when it came time for him to give his speech, the people got up, went across the street, and he read it over there. And the people followed him over there. But what nonsense it is, this political correctness of the day. I saw where they had a sign with some of the police cars. Blessed are the peacemakers. Some was offended at that, so they had to take it off. Notice where Vice President Pence was giving a commencement address in Notre Dame, Catholic University. Over 100 people got up and walked out on his commencement address. Actually, they invited the president to come first, and they wouldn't even have him there. They wouldn't allow the president of the United States to come and give a commencement address because of his stance on immigration or abortion or LGBT, whatever it was. They wouldn't even let him come. Now this one gets the cake. I saw this with my own eyes. The other night I was watching a basketball game, and they have these professional commentators that give a commentation before and during the halftime, and Shaquille O'Neal and Kennedy Jet Smith and Charles Barkley, and there's got a white guy stuck in there too, and his name's Ernie Johnson. Well, during the presentation at halftime, they all started laughing. Well, what happened, Shaquille O'Neal was about 7 feet tall, way over 300 pounds, and he had taken his shoe off. And the camera went down and focused on his foot. He has a size 22 foot. He wears a shoe. He's a big guy. And what they were focusing on, apparently, if you play any sports, you're going to get some bones broken. So apparently at some point in time, Shaquille's big toe had been broken, and that toe went down and formed a right angle. The next day, I saw on Fox News where people were horrified. They were shocked, and it was sickening. They couldn't stand it. It offended so many people. Well, I felt sorry for the guy. He had a broken toe. I know he had to have problems with it because I've had some broken bones. But it didn't offend me. I felt sorry for him. But people were offended because he showed that toe. And you couldn't, the comments that the people made about it was unbelievable. So it goes on and on and on. Anymore, the protests on college campuses and high schools across America of conservative speakers is getting worse and worse. Now it's associated with violence because they're not politically correct. What happens with political correctness is this, and what it has to do with 2 Timothy 3, where people are lovers of their own selves. We do not want to hear the words that are being said. They are offensive simply because you don't agree with me. Now that's pretty vain when you get to the point where you can't listen to the other side of the story. When you're so vain that you think that you're right. Now Proverbs says there's a way that seems right to a man. And apparently for all these political speakers here and all these PC cops, if you don't say it in agreement with them, you got to be wrong. But God doesn't say it that way. He said, there's a way that seems right to a man. I think it's Proverbs 14:12, and he gives it again in the 16th chapter. But notice what the Bible says over in Proverbs, the 18th chapter. In Proverbs 18, the Bible is literally filled with wisdom. If more people would read it and actually look up the scriptures, they may get some help in how they should live their lives. But here we see, and I found this to be true, in Proverbs 18, verse 17, he that is first in his own cause seems just. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means when you tell your side of the story, you think you're right. But his neighbor comes and searches him out. In other words, when you hear the other side of the story, and there's always two sides to a story, you just may find yourself to be wrong. But when you don't even listen to the other side, how are you ever going to know that you're wrong? So you go through life thinking, I'm right. And then when somebody says something contrary to what you say, I'm offended. And I want a safe space. And I want to get away from all these people that are persecuting me. And if you say something that's contrary to what you believe, what's happening today, and you hear it almost every single day, you're a racist. And they're using the race card to focus in on their own attention. Now you see what's happening, and it's getting worse and worse. And it's going to continue to get worse as we get closer to Christ's return, where people are going to focus in to the point, and they're going to unite, and you're beginning to see it now. That's happening particularly in California and Chicago and New York and some of these liberal cities. You're beginning to see violence taking place with it. And you begin to understand now how we can fall as a country from within and destroy our own selves. We read over in Romans 12 and verse 3, Romans 12 verse 3, what God says we should be doing. But they will ignore it, and they won't listen to it. They won't listen to the other side of the story. They won't listen particularly what God has to say about it. But it says here in Romans 12 and verse 3, for I say through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith. So if people would begin to think that others have a side, others have certain things that may be good. I mean, everybody doesn't have, your way is not always the best way. There may be more than one way of doing things. And so we need to be able to take a good look at ourselves sometimes and realize that we may not always be right. Now let's go to Psalm 119, 165. Psalm 119, 165. And of course, I know a lot of people won't adhere to this either, but I'm going to tell you anyway. It says in Psalm 119, 165, great peace have they which love your law. If we as a nation and we as a world would start listening to God's law and adhering to it, then we would find peace. And frankly, that's the only way that we're ever going to know peace on this earth. And if you do that, if you adhere to God's law, nothing will offend you. You won't have to be a PC policeman. You won't be offended when somebody else gives their side of the story. Because sometimes when you sit down and actually work it out, you can resolve some issues. And we even read in the Bible that if you have something against someone, then you go to that person directly. And you try to reason through it, and you give your side of the story, and you listen to what they're saying. And maybe sometimes you can actually resolve the issues. We read back in Isaiah, the first chapter, even God said back there, come, let us reason together. Even God is willing to listen, even willing to reason. Remember how he did with Job? Remember how he listened to Job on and on and on, till finally he said, I've had enough, Job. You got to listen to my side of the story. And once Job heard God's side of the story, he said, I abhor myself. Because he said, I heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now I see you. I see your side of the story, and I understand how great you are and what a low life I am. And many of us need to take that perspective as well. So this self-centered world is one of the very signs that is pointing to Jesus Christ's return. And we're told to watch. And as you continue to watch and you begin to see the events that are taking place on your television screen, just know that it won't be much longer before Jesus Christ comes back and sets it all straight.